Where's that darn Cardi Jew? They're making us rabbinists look horrible. Shalom, and welcome to another exciting edition, hopefully very informative, very inspirational, and educational for the Torah Watchman Show, LLC. None other than your humble host, Ben-Emmett. If you detect a tinge of mourning in my soul and heart, you see it in my eyes. I've been withholding tears today. Even at work, it's very, very difficult for this Jew to go to work in a secular, non-Jewish environment, and while you're still thinking about the immensity of loss and life in Israel, something second to the Holocaust. I don't want to get into a lot of details. The reports of the war between Israel's military forces, namely the IDF, trying to take back territory briefly lost along the Gaza border, and the 1,000 plus people, Israelis, who have been murdered. Most of them, all of them, are Israeli citizens, or do American citizens. So the Americans have been murdered, kidnapped as well. We have about 100 people for this hour that are still missing or kidnapped. I've heard the horrific stories of little babies that were massacred. I don't want to get any details. It's too gore to even describe children being massacred in front of their parents. Folks, this is exactly, you go back in the annals of time, and from 1941 through 1945, what Hitler and his henchmen and his exterminists, his final solution to Jewish people throughout Europe. This is what you see here. And many people are taken back. How can Hamas, which is another name for Palestinians, how could they be so brutal? The European Union has stopped funding the Palestinians altogether. Many other countries have decided to turn the page to the Palestinians and put everything on hold. No more talk about two-state solution. No more talk about funding. Everyone is just aghast. This is across a race and creed and ethnicity. Even the UAE, the Emirates, Arab Emirates are putting blue and white lights upon their towers. The White House has done this. The President of the United States has done this. Commend him for doing this. Made a very good speech, trying to help with the morale. I understand that we feel totally cut off in America. I can't speak for Melbourne, Australia, or London, England. I can't speak for any other countries than America. I'm sorry, but we have brothers and sisters, we have uncles and aunts, we have cousins, we have relations in Israel right now that we don't know their whereabouts, and they're either in bomb shelters, or they're in the process of trying to get out of the country, or they're held captive, or maybe in a remote kibbutz in the Negev desert. I don't know. We need to pray for the Shalom of Jerusalem. I'm sorry, I had to get this off my chest. Many people come to me over the past, and I've not really done a very detailed documentary video on this issue. Why the hatred in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis, namely Jews? Why the hatred? Now, I can go back and give you a history lesson, but that would probably bore you to tears, literally. You know about all the history of the Roman Catholic Church and their expulsions of the Jewish people throughout the ages. You know about the Great Crusades. You know the massacring of Jews, burning them alive and buildings and synagogues and things in Judea when they invaded so-called Palestine during that time, 1099 on forward. Also murdering Arabs and Muslims alike. We suffered the same crimes against humanity, both Muslims and Jews alike. We think we'd see some commonality there as far as discrimination and bigotry and just hatred. But I can give you numbers and things like that. 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed a ship, to Americas or whatever, and discovered XYZ. The thing is, he took a lot of Jews on the ship because Queen Isabella and their passive king took everything, everything from the Jewish people, took their money, the treasure, their savings, their homes, everything, and forced them to either be baptized. You heard about the Great Inquisition, beheaded, tortured, and everything else, or to leave the country. Well, the same thing happened in England. By the early 1600s, no Jews were allowed to be in England by edict of the king of that time. And it goes on and on. That this is the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, and later people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others like that, early church leaders. They are equally guilty and equally have blood on their hands, and pronouncing judgments upon the Jewish people, like burning their synagogue, burning their Talmud, burning their Torah, burning all the sacred works. Now, this is the work of the hands of evil Christians in the past, in the Middle Ages on forward, and I'm not putting indictments upon Christians today. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not here to judge anyone. I'm just talking about a brief history lesson. But what a lot of people try to understand in their minds, they just can't. I'm talking to Noahites, I'm talking about even Jews. They don't understand the overt hatred between Arabs, Muslims, and Jews. Now, they may say that the Christians hate us because there's 421 anti-Semitic passages in the New Testament Bible, and because all the bigotry comes out of there, and the pastors, all the expositions, in the Middle Ages and forward, they took that anti-Semitic passages and turned it to vile hatred against the Jewish people, because they blamed the Jews for crucifying Christ, when it's the Romans that did that, right? But anyway, the Arab conflict has been going on forever. I mean, there were Arab wars in the 1900s. You've heard about all this conflict leading up to 1948, or independence of Israel, the first time in 2,000 years. The acquisition of real estate and land, 1967. We beat the pants off the Arab nations. We gave all that land back. About 1994 and other agreements. Of course, 1973. Before that was the Golan Heights. And a lot of people lost a lot of lives when Syria and Egypt attacked Israel on Yom Kippur. Where do I start? We just had Rosh Hashanah, right? And leading up to that, we had Holocaust prayers, 50,000, 100,000 Jews at Temple Mount, along the Kotel, just praying and weeping. You could hear the weeping and crying of the shofar blast, very touching. I've never seen so many Jews praying before, repenting, teshuvah. And I said to myself, something big is going to happen. Something big is going to happen. I don't know what. But sure enough, as soon as it was Simchat Torah, early last Saturday morning, a massive historic attack between Hamas terrorists, Palestinians, and Gaza was launched against the Israeli state. Again, 1,000 people dead, 100 or more people hostages, human shields, whatever you call it. But back again to my premise in the very introduction. Why the hatred between Arab Muslims and Jews? It goes back 4,000 years, literally. It really does. Let me give you some context, please. And I have some notes in here. Bear with me because I want to stay on script. I don't want you to think I'm opinionated, okay? So everyone knows the story in Bereshit, and we're about to have a parsha on Bereshit beginning this coming Shabbat. Abraham was blessed so that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky or as the sand on the seashore. You can read that in Genesis chapter 26:4. That covenantal promise was given to Abraham. Abraham was not a Jew. He was a Noahide. He was a Mesopotamian, Chaldean, came from what northern Iraq is today, essentially, up in that area. That's where he originated. God called him, made him a monotheistic person, gave him a vision that he alone accepted and trusted by faith, tested by faith and righteousness, that his forefathers, the very pagan and evil, did not ever accept. He left his family. Left his wealth. He could have had a city named after him, but he was a nomad. He left, and people said he was very peculiar because you looked at someone that was rich, of nobility and royalty, but he was in the desert as someone, as a pilgrim, making a pilgrimage. And and wandering in the desert and camels and things of this nature, caravan. But Abraham and his wife Sarah, had an interesting relationship in that when most men marry a woman, like a Jew per se, in that context, you expect to have a son, you expect to have children. But Abraham married Sarai knowing that she was infertile and born infertile, and she could never hope of having any child through her. But he loved her and he cared for her. I'm not going to get into the reasons why. You could say, she was actually related to him. It's from honor and the blessed memory of his brother who had passed away. But anyway, there was other promises made to Abraham by Elohim. Okay, the inheritance and rights of first circumcision. So, waiting forever, Sarai was 90 years old. Abraham was getting close to 99 years old, close to a century. And, the story of the three angels who would announce the birth of their son caused laughter among Sarai. And it was not disrespectful, but a long story short, she could not believe it. Abraham heard before that he would be a great father of nations and have many, many descendants, but he did not. He trusted God, but he didn't know how it was possible. It was not physically possible. God works in the realm of impossibility at all. It's what you call miracles before witnesses, folks. But anyway, eventually, what Sarah said, we've waited on the Lord our God, your Lord, your God, your Asher, Jehovah, Elohim, for a very long. Maybe it is his will, and it's in our custom in Mesopotamia. Hey, I have this maidservant. Her name is Hagar, the Egyptian. She's fertile, she's young, and she can give you a child. I cannot. But she can have a child on my behalf, and we will raise him to be our child and fulfill God's promises ourselves. You heard the saying, don't birth an Ishmael. In other words, don't read in God's will into your life choices because it's convenient, because you're short-term minded, God is long-term minded. This happens all the time in human nature. But what happened is that Hagar did bear a child through Abraham illegitimately, okay? In other words, this was not God's perfect plan. This is something that Abraham and Sarai raced to the finish line without Elohim's blessing. But, just because we mess up, just because we make mistakes, does not mean that God will forsake his promises and covenant made to us. So God said, I will make you fruitful and plentiful in your descendants. Well, this child was named Ishmael, none other. And then Ishmael had to be blessed, regardless of the sin of indiscretion between Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah's lack of, faith and confidence and patience, okay? So there was some testing of virtue in that relationship. Now, when Ishmael became 12 to 13 years of age, Isaac was born, So that was the promise, the miracle child was promised. And there became some contention in the house of Abraham, in the tent of Abraham during that time. There was some arguing. God had told Abraham that all the men in your household would be circumcised because this is a covenant. It's like a contract. It's like, as a brand or whatever, a seal that I've accepted you, you accepted me. The Gentiles around him did not circumcise their sons, but this is something very unique, again, a very peculiar race of people that God was building within Abraham and building within his descendants and building within his nomadic tribe, per se, okay? And of course, Abraham was circumcised in his old age, too. He was 99 years old when this happened, approximately when Ishmael was 12 to 13 years of age. In Islam, all Muslims, by tradition, they circumcise their sons at age 13. In Judaism, it's 8 days after a little boy is born, okay? That is our tradition. Now, God had told Abraham he would establish a covenant through Isaac. That would be his inheritance. In other words, in the Mesopotamian custom, and it became the Jewish custom through the years, 100 years in the future, several hundred years in the future, like through Yaakov, is that the firstborn always received the greatest of all inheritances. So if you had a Baruch, you had blessings, you want to extend your child for a good future, prosperity, riches, fame, fortune, numerous children, descendants, protection from your enemies, then those blessings went first to that legitimate son, and that was Isaac and not Ishmael. In fact, there was a controversy that occurred in the tent of Abraham, and that when Ishmael grew up, and then a teenager, I suppose, maybe he was 17 or 18, I'm not sure how old he was, but he started making fun of his little brother, a half-brother, Esau. And it was not just that. There's something called the evil eye. Maybe Hagar is saying, Ishmael, it's a bond that I will never lose with your husband, and that kind of thing. You have two women fighting over the same man. It sounds like a very bad B-rated soap opera, but that was happening. Sarah beginning resenting Hagar, and because the infighting, the jealousy, and essentially the bullying of her son Esau, and was a bad influence, and she wanted to raise her son differently than Hagar the Egyptian, who was a pagan, a polytheistic person from Egypt. She did not have the same moral, social norms as Sarai and Abraham, essentially. Okay, to each their own. So Sarai pleaded with Abraham, get this woman out of her home, let her take her illegitimate son out of here, free this home of stress and negativity, and let's focus on raising our family. Abraham was very bitter about this. He was angry, he was upset, he was sorrowful in his heart because he loved Ishmael. He loved Ishmael, didn't want to give him up like this, okay? Even though he knew in his heart and soul when he had Isaac, he made a big mistake, big error of judgment. But, long story short, when Hagar and Ishmael were driven out of the tent of Abraham near, I believe, near Bathsheba, that's where she's going. She's heading toward Egypt, I believe. And an angel of the Lord met her along the way because she was dying of thirst. And their son was very faint. They ran out of food. Abraham only gave them limited rations. But the angel of the Lord gave her miraculous water, miraculous nourishment. This is in the Torah. It's in Bereshit. It's not a story. It is written, okay? However, Islam has a different take of Ishmael, and I'll give that to you in just a moment. But the angel of the Lord's promise, Hagar, do not be worried, do not be stressed or faint-hearted, for God has promised to make your son a great nation because of his promises he's made to his father Abraham. Okay? So there was some solace in that too. Essentially said that Genesis chapter 17, but God also warned Hagar that he would be a wild, uncontrollable, don't give a man, quote unquote. I'm not going to get into any euphemisms here, metaphors, but his hand will be against everyone. In other words, he'd be a warrior, he'd be a fighter, he'd be a hunter, he'd be very skilled and shooting the bow and arrow. People will be against him, he'd be against them. Essentially, he would be an uncontrollable, very chaotic person, okay? You could read on and describe his character at that time, complete polar opposite of more calmer and passive Isaac, okay? So Ishmael and Isaac were the polar opposite brothers, half-brothers. Tribe and became a great nation apart. Where did he go? Well, Hagar took Ishmael to find a wife, and more than likely she went back to Egypt, okay? Now, Hagar was not a Jew. She was not a Noahide. She did not follow the one true God of Abraham, okay? Now, in summary of this story between Ishmael and Isaac, Islam, or their story in the Quran, Muhammad actually is claimed to trace his ancestry all the way back to Ishmael. Now, Ishmael, honestly with you, he's the father of all Arab nations. 52 million Arabs claim him as their master ancestor, and Arabs would not be Arabs today if it wasn't for that indiscretion between Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. But God deals with contrast. In order to prosecute virtue and righteousness and unrighteousness, morality and immorality, there has to be yin and yang between that. Okay, there's a reason what happened. And of course, Ishmael became a pagan. He became polytheistic. Actually, Esau, formed Edom, and later on, he actually married some of the daughters of Ishmael to get back in the family. Not important, but this is how the Arab genealogy was formed between the seed of Esau and Egyptian ancestry. Okay, so this is what came together. Now the story is epic about Hagar being driven out in the desert. Again, Islam tells a very similar story. However, what they do, they totally ignore the birthright issue with Esau. Okay, so what happened actually is that they had a bonding relationship with Ishmael and Abraham. Instead of Abraham, they did not mention about the binding of Isaac, about going up to Mount Moriah, about the ultimate sacrificial offering that God had asked Abraham. He passed all the tasks that God had given him. They don't talk about that, even though a lot is said in the Quran about Abraham, because he was a righteous, tzaddik man of high regard, both in Judaism and Islam. But Ishmael was the individual, supposedly according to the Prophet Muhammad, that received the right inheritance of firstborn, not his younger brother Esau. So when I'm saying there was a blood feud, began generationally, hundreds of years in the future, from these two dichotomy of truths: the seed of Isaac, the seed of Ishmael. They could not trying to say come to a truce. They're always animosity with each other. This is what the prophecy was of the angel said to Hagar, the kind of person Ishmael would be, and based on his full array of choices. Okay, and you could read. We can read more of this about the covenant given to Abraham to confirm that Isaac was indeed the one true child and none other, the son of Abraham and Sarai, to give the firstborn inheritance to. You could read this in Bereshit chapter 22, 2 through 8, okay? So where I'm going is, before I get into the next chapter of this documentary, the main reason why Muslims and Jews don't get along has nothing to do with Christianity, even though they've both been persecuted because of Christianity. I already told you in the introduction about the Great Crusade. What they differ the most is over who received the righteous inheritance of the firstborn, Isaac or Ishmael. There was jealousy between these two boys in the very beginning that caused Ishmael to be driven out and to the land and to have other choices and go to different places and events and outcomes. So this is story and narrative goes back 4,000 years on how this has happened. So you have the Torah that has one story about Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, and the story of the 12 tribes of Israel, and then the eventual occupation of the lands of Eretz Israel, Canaan, the Hittites, Hittites, and other tribal people in Canaan, versus the Arab states that are essentially trace their ancestry from Ishmael, namely Muhammad. Now, I'm not going to make any judgment against Islam. This is not the purpose of the documentary. The purpose of the documentary is to point out the historical truth, why there is a horrible, horrific war in Israel today, why the Palestinians have an obvious systemic hatred against the Jews, why Hamas in their own charter wants every Jew to be exterminated, the same kind of thing that was going on in the mind of the crazy man of Hitler. So I'm going to summarize a few other things that I discovered recently in research. Okay, now as you know that the King Solomon, the golden age of Israel, after that happened, after his son, and there was a great civil war, etc., where northern Israel was eventually carried off into Assyria, resettled in foreign lands, even in the Orient, in Asia, in China, and those other countries there, all because they adopted the culture and theology and religious beliefs of the Canaanites, of the pagan nations there. The thing is that Israel, responsible for carrying the torch of the Torah to the rest of the world, they failed that miserably. They disobeyed God's commandments, even though they swore a covenant promise. When you have knowledge, is power, and when you have that kind of knowledge, God judges more severely than someone is totally ignorant of the laws of God, the laws of Moshe. So we've been exiled all over the world, okay? Now, of course, during the passage of time, in the Persian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire, during that happened, the occupation of Judea and Samaria and northern Israel, the Jews have lost their sovereignty of the land. When the Roman Empire fell and essentially imploded and spread apart and was Christianized, then you have the reintroduction of Persians. And again, these were Arab-like people. Their faith was different than the Jewish people. Now, before Muhammad was born, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think he was born in 570 CE. He died around 630 CE. So during this time, the Arabs were polytheistic people. And no one is going to assault me for saying that because it's true. Muhammad achieved a lot with the Arab people in that he transformed their one-to-many God worship, pagan worship, to monotheistic worship of Allah, the one supreme divine being, which even rabbis today, Orthodox rabbis, say that Elohim and Allah are essentially the same entity, okay? Whatever you believe in that is your opinion. But what I'm saying is that Muhammad introduced a new form of worship among his Arab brethren, the descendants of Ishmael, in a monotheistic relationship with one true God. And he made the claim in the Quran through divine revelation that he was the last one true prophet, the only intercessor between Allah and the Arab people. And essentially they become known as Muslims, and the Islamic religion was born between the 6th and 7th century. Now, the last part of this documentary is to point out the priority of worship for the Jew versus the Muslim, okay? As you know, there's a group of Jews that make regular annual pilgrimage to Mecca every year during Ramadan, okay? Saudi Arabia, because that is where they believe that Muhammad was born. They believe he was born in Medina. They believe he made a great pilgrimage to Mecca, and so on. But also because of division between reformers of Islam, and then the more traditional people, the two caliphs per se, were at war with one another, essentially over different interpretations of the Quran, to the end of the reformers burning all the original written Quran that was written by hand and copied, just like the Torah is. All the original writings of Muhammad, supposedly, and the prayer books and the commentaries were burned in favor of the reformers' interpretation and elaboration of the Quran. So the Quran you could buy on Amazon today is probably not the same Quran that Muhammad actually wrote deliberately by hand and through divine inspiration. Okay, it's just what it is. Now, with this division and conflict, it literally between an uncle of Muhammad or someone like that. Muhammad did not have children. He lived about 60 years of age or so. So he had brother-in-laws and uncles, and they essentially broke apart into their different belief systems and formed two main caliphs. Okay, interesting enough, Petra, in Jordan, you've seen different videos of Petra, beautiful, almost cathedral-like, cut out in the rock face of the mountain there. Well, this was Petra. It was a great earthquake just before Muhammad was born. The point is, I try to make is that the places of worship just around the time of Muhammad's life, the mosques that were built, the Qibla was actually a wall or place that faced the direction where Muslims pray. And all of those pointed toward Petra, not Mecca, but however, about 100 years after Muhammad died, there was many other revelations per se, and elaborations and editing and rewriting and a new authorship and everything else. I already told you the original copies of the Quran and those prayer books were burned by the opposing caliph, okay? So you had a caliph over most of Saudi Arabia, Eastern Africa, then you had a caliph over Spain and Morocco in that area too, smaller. But the ones over Saudi Arabia won out, the ones over Spain lost, okay? So what happened is that within 100 years after Muhammad passed away, and that was 625, so you're talking about 725 or so, the 7th century, that there was a huge change in the way mosques were built, as namely the Qibla and others, what the directional vector, what these places of worship and the wall that all Muslims face when they kneel, where it points to, okay? When we pray always toward Jerusalem. However, during that time, many of the original mosques were destroyed through earthquake or war. Many of the sacred writings that talked about what I just told you, Petra, not Mecca. Actually, Quran talks about talks more about Petra than Mecca. I think Mecca is maybe mentioned once. The thing is that there's a confusion between terms. It's not really critically important for this documentary. The point I'm trying to say is where Muslims originally worship was pointing toward Petra. Never was it Jerusalem, okay? And then they later on, within 100 years after Muhammad passed away, they started redirecting the vector of direction of prayer toward Mecca, simply because the new translation of their Quran talked about Mecca and not Petra, okay? It was never Jerusalem. The word Jerusalem doesn't occur anywhere in the Quran. And as far as the Muhammad's magical journey he had and his vision he had while he was sleeping, going to the farthest mosque on a steed, actually was talking about the mosque that he left back in Petra versus Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is actually in Saudi Arabia. You heard me right. Almost everyone who is educated, scholarly among Islam has admitted this truth, okay? Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Saudi Arabia. In fact, there was a slightly different name before that. I cannot remember that's mentioned. But the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Temple Mount today in Jerusalem was actually built hundreds of years after Muhammad had passed away. So it's impossible to say Muhammad got on top of that mosque and went to a furthest mosque over there. Muhammad never set foot in Jerusalem, and it actually was a low priority in Islam during that time for several hundred years. No one talked about Jerusalem. No one cared about it. They knew it was a Jewish city. They didn't care about it. Well, as time passed, as the Persians were driven out of Judea, then the Ottomans came in, the Turks came in. They imposed a different caliphate, a different way of worship. So you had the more traditionalists that focused on, say, the Holy Land and Jerusalem, versus those that were more reformed and say, we worship in Mecca. So you literally have Muslims each year of Ramadan. Some of them go to Jerusalem, some of them go to Mecca. And simply because various interpretations of the Quran. That's my point I'm trying to make. To this day, when Muslims pray on Temple Mount, they never point themselves toward the Holy of Holies, which we believe is under the mosque, the oldest mosque there, which is called Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is renamed Al-Aqsa Mosque, because those Muslims in the various caliphates in the past, they knew they could not go to Mecca and worship with the others because of conflict of interest, because disagreements over theology, etc., etc. So they made a fake mosque called Al-Aqsa Mosque there to replace the one that in reality exists in Saudi Arabia. Again, jealousy, infighting between these Muslims and each other. You know, they had wars, they had fighting. You don't need Jews to cause Muslims to fight each other and kill each other. You don't need Christians to do that. They do that themselves. You have Shia and Sunni Muslim today. But again, the center point of worship for Muslims has never been Jerusalem. This is something fairly new with the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, Hamas is a splinter group from the Muslim Brotherhood. Both are considered to be international Islamic terrorist organizations. Okay, the fact that Israel is permitted and tolerated this in Gaza since 2007 just blows my mind. Why the United States encouraged Israel to make friends with these Palestinians, these radical Islamists there who want to kill the Jews. How many missile attacks have been exchanged between the nation of Israel and Hamas throughout the years? The last war, this is going as I speak and cough, is the most horrific, historic, deadly, and lethal war since the Holocaust. It really is. It really is. The critical mass of hatred has reached its limit, you would think. How can Jews be hated so much by their neighbor and kin? I mean, literally, Arabs are genetically similar to the Jewish people. We all come from Shem. We all come from that Semitic line. Ishmael and Isaac were both half brothers, so they were related. They were related. They were blood relations, even though they had come from a different mother. So, the dichotomy of truth is amazing. You have Hamas that even says, all of Jerusalem, all of Temple Mount is known as Al-Aqsa. Well, that's their center point of worship. That's where they claim to be the holiest place there. Many people think that big golden dome of rock is a mosque. It actually is not. It's a shrine. It's a historical shrine. It's actually registered with UNESCO as something to be preserved, okay? Because it's been there since, I would say, 800, 900 CE. But the right of ownership of the land in Eretz Israel is still up to debate, subject to interpretation by the United Nations and other nations. Who has a legal right to the land of Eretz Israel, the Arab or the Jew? We can say, to be fair, they both have some sort of land rights there because they've been there generationally, okay? The reason why Arabs have generational homes, they have buried their dead there for hundreds of years, is because they invaded that country. They invaded that country. But there have been Jews there, for 3,000 years, or longer. They've always been there. Am Yisrael High. We've always been Jews there. And Jews there in the 1930s and early 1900s were known as Palestinian Jews. They really were. I actually met a woman one time. She said on her birth certificate, it was before 1948, it said born in Jerusalem of Palestine. The word Palestine is actually something that came up in 135 CE in the Roman Empire. Hadrian decided to destroy Jerusalem, de-Judify it, destroy the DNA of Judaism forever by turning it into a pagan place of worship. He put an idol of Zeus on Temple Mount and so on. And it was a great exile of Jews, and many Jews were murdered and slaughtered and crucified and so on because they tried to rise up against Roman Empire and failed miserably. You heard about the massacre of Masada, for instance. The thing I'm trying to say is that Hadrian renamed Judea, all of Judea, Syria Philistia, okay? Syria Philistia. And over a period of time, the Latinized names and morphed and changes as words do in various languages. But no, it was changed to Palestine, okay? So Palestine came from the original word Syria Philistia. So Hadrian was thinking, if we rename Judea after the arch enemy of Israel, which is the Philistines, that he would thoroughly destroy the psychology, heart and soul of the Jewish people. And he almost did. He almost did. So the whole discussion about Palestine, Palestinians and Israel, they have been there forever. And the Jews said, no, we've been here forever. It goes back to that blood feud again. But today, contemporary, it's over who has the right to own land, to build homes and have families and have military control over that property. Like Gaza, for instance. Gaza was given away. It was taken from Egypt when Egypt lost the war with Israel. It was taken away in 2005 by a land grab by George Walker Bush in 2005. Okay, and of course the Palestinians turned it into a terrorist, a hotbed of Islamic extremists. Okay, and you have ISIS embedded within Hamas today, and that explains the horrific massacres and beheadings and killings what's happening to my people now. But as far as the Palestinians having a homeland there, this is something that the Egyptian-born Yasser Arafat in 1964 envisioned himself. When he tried unsuccessfully to have an insurrection against the king of Jordan during that time, he failed, and he was expelled from that nation. He returned to Egypt and came back to Israel, and then took the Jordanian flag and made it into a Palestinian flag and declared a Palestinian state, declared Palestinian Liberation Organization. The key word there is liberation, liberate Palestine from Jewish occupation. And it's been going on and on. So he invented the Palestinian people as Arabs, and Palestinians are literally Syrian Arabs or Jordanian Arabs. 75% of Palestinians are in Jordan. There's refugee camps in Egypt of Palestinians, a refugee camp in Syria and Lebanon. These people are Jordanians and Syrians and maybe some Egyptians that have been there generationally and just have not gone back to any number of the Arab countries that are controlled by Muslim caliphates and so, like in Africa and Saudi Arabia and so on. I mean, they continue to remain there, okay? And they wonder why they're in a twilight zone between Jews and themselves, okay? Why they have different viewpoints, different theological beliefs. Muhammad is their prophet. Moshe is my prophet. And we both, Jews don't believe Muhammad is our prophet. And but even though most Muslims, Moses is mentioned more in the Quran than Muhammad. So Moses and Muhammad is actually their prophet. They also believe in Jesus as their Messiah too, which we don't believe in that. So how do we get to this horrible point in this war in Judea with all this information I've given you? It's a tribal blood feud over jealousy and envy and competition over an inheritance and birthright, okay? It goes back to the time of Abraham, and it continues to various wars and exile of the Jewish people, people moving in and out Judea, all the wars and everything else. I've described Persia, described Greece, the Greek Empire. I would describe the Roman Empire and Persia again, then the Ottoman, up until the 1930s when they were driven out by Great Britain. And the Jews were all squeezed in the middle there, okay? The so-called thing about Palestinians and Hamas having control of Temple Mount, listen, these people are monsters, they're barbarians, and they live in the 4th century, 4th and 5th century. They really do. And no one wants the Palestinians in their country because they don't trust them. They don't trust them. And don't say there's Gaza is full of innocent Palestinians, because they raise their children to hate the Jews. It's in their textbooks. They hand their sons over to the Hamas terrorists and military commanders to be trained to be assassins. Essentially, that's what they're doing. I feel for the women and children, really do. And in every war, you have casualties. You have civilian casualties. We didn't start this war, but we will end it. The thing is, I'm trying to point out, is that Jews have always been in the land. The Quran said the land of Israel will belong to the Jews. The original version, at least, did. Muhammad knew that Jerusalem was a Jewish city. He didn't have a doubt about that. That's why he didn't worry about it. Okay? Muhammad generally had respect for holy sites and things of that nature. Okay? He had a problem with different Arabs that didn't believe and didn't follow his brand of religion, which became Islam, which is probably the greatest of all religions that's on the planet. That and Christianity, and Jews are the minority there. So I hope you learned something with this documentary. I've been a little bit long-winded, but I want to get my words out here that you have to understand history to understand why we're in the situation we are in Israel. Okay, why it's so horrific? Because you cannot get over that blood feud. If it's true that Esau received the first rights, the blessed inheritance from Abraham and not Ishmael, you see where I'm going. The land of Eretz Israel is undeniably belongs to the Jewish people. However, if the Quran is right, and Ishmael received that birthright, then it belongs to the Arabs, right? And that's where we're at. It's different interpretation of Bibles and religious scripture and things of this nature, but it's also a tribal blood feud that goes back 4,000 years. Go figure. My heart goes out to the Jewish people suffering in Israel. My heart actually goes out to the Palestinians that actually want to moderate the view among Jewish people. And now Palestinians, their reputation is close to dirt because of what the Hamas Palestinians have done. And we all have to deal with the mess, right? God isn't on his throne and God is in control. Why is God allowing this to happen? Folks, it's about teshuvah. It's about forgiveness of sin. We need to get on our knees and pray and ask God to forgive us the sin. Israel needs to return back to tribal Judaism, return back to the laws of Moshe, stop fighting among each other. Jews can be our worst enemies. We don't need Arabs to be our enemies. We are our worst enemies. We need to be unified if we're going to survive as a nation. And right now, we're being tested like none other time before since the Holocaust. Reb Yara ben-Emmett signing out. Shalom Aleichem. Baruch Dayan Emet for those people that are suffering. Refuah Shalema, those people that are recovering, whether it's psychological or physical. Misha Bar for those people in hospital. Israel's asking for doctors, even retired in other nations, to come to Israel because there's not enough doctors and not enough hospital beds to treat the wounded. Take care of yourself. I'll see you real soon. Please pray for the Shalom of Jerusalem and pray for peace in the Middle East. Take care. Goodbye.